OTAN, Outreach and Technical Assistance Network.
Increasing equity in online and blended learning. OTAN Technology and Distance Learning Symposium 2020.
We're here to talk about equity and technology in an online and blended learning environment. So let me just introduce myself before we dive in. I'm Sudie Whalen. I'm the online course coordinator for CalPro. Hi, I see all these familiar faces in here. I get really excited at this conference. So we host exactly 16 online facilitated courses. Kevin Belcher is one of our facilitators, is just wrapped up actually mastering the English language proficiency standards. And then we also have a lot of self-directed courses and things like that. And then we have a bunch of communities of practice, all kinds of options for PD, all of which are free to adult educators and administrators across the state. You can host something at your site if you want to. We're already taking requests for next year, so if you want to know about that, talk to me after. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. So that's part of my job, but I'm also a technical assistance consultant with American Institutes for Research, and CalPro is an AIR project. And one of the things that I focus on is equity. I do a lot of talking about equity. I do a lot of presenting on equity. My main focuses are career technical education, integrated education and training, and equity in adult ed. And then I also lead our CalPro Professional Learning Communities Institute. I, of course, work here in California. I get to work with OTAN quite a bit. This is literally my favorite conference, and I go to a lot of conferences. But it's because every time I come here, I always learn something new, and I just get really excited and hype. So that's why music, when we first get started, we're all gonna have fun. So this is gonna be a fun session, but it's gonna be a kind of serious session because we're talking about kind of heavy topics today. And so I want you to feel comfortable and feel relaxed enough to be honest and open and ask your questions and talk about things that you're doing in your classroom and things like that. That's what we're here for, okay? But we also want to have a good time, okay? So that's what I want to do while we're here. So just to make sure our technology is functioning and everybody can get set up, because we're going to use Poll Everywhere a few times today. Alrighty, and so what you're going to do, the question is, did you attend Sudie's session last year on learner persistence in an online and blended learning session? And we talked about design and things like that. This is actually the third time I've talked about important aspects of online course development and design. Previously, we talked about engagement and things like that. Last year, we talked about how do we get students looking at things to a way that's visually appealing so that they don't have the scroll of death and they just give up, right? And so today, we're going to talk about equity and making sure students are all feeling welcome into the course, and that's all students. Well, we're talking about regardless of ability, gender, ethnicity, anything like that, right? Alrighty, so the question was, how have you attended my session last year or attended a session before? And I didn't have the pleasure. Oh, that was so nice. One person responded. I thought all of y'all said you got in. Oh, no. No, unfortunately. Okay, now they're coming up. Okay, so that was just a practice exercise. Whether or not you were with me last year, if you weren't, I've seen your face before. It's wonderful to see you again. And if you weren't, it is a pleasure to meet you. So let's move forward. So we're going to talk about education equity. What does that mean in terms of education? And we're also going to talk a little bit about bias in technology. And when I'm talking about bias in technology, I'm not talking about like your individual bias and how you bring that into your classrooms, although that can happen, right? We all hold bias. It's nothing to be ashamed of. That's just something that we all have. I have bias. Everybody has some form of bias, right? The goal is to not project that onto our students and for us to identify our biases and figure out ways to, get around those, right? But when we're talking about today is how algorithms also affect bias, and we use algorithms within our coursework and different things that we do, whether we're asking students to go out and search for something, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then we're going to talk about what we can do to increase equity in our own classrooms, in our own courses, whether we're doing a blended course, which means our students are in the classroom with us sometimes, and other times they're online, or we're doing a fully online course, right? Because we know representation matters, we know access matters, and we know that every student does not have the same needs and abilities, right? How many of you, when you think about visual impairment, right, what do you think of when you think of that? Blind people, right? And so you think of, okay, I need to make sure someone who's blind can see this. Do you ever think about someone who's colorblind? Right? So just little things like that can make a huge difference to our students when we're talking about being visually impaired. So we're going to watch a video on education equity. All right, so who doesn't understand what equity means? So we all get it, right? We all know that when we're talking about education equity, we're talking about providing the needs of our student, not necessarily equality, because when we talk about doing things exactly the same way, right, all of our students don't need the same things. Which is why we differentiate instruction, why we do things in various different ways, why we make sure that our different students are represented and that they're supported. When students with disabilities or students with, not just disabilities, but we're talking about students with learning disabilities and things like that, helping them to have access that they need to education, right? And so we all understand, we are all in agreement that we know that when it comes to education, we can't do everything equally, right? Okay, so, but what happens is, a lot of times, bias trickles into our online courses, and it's not something that happens on purpose. Nobody builds an online course with the intention of being biased. No one says, you know what, I don't really care if my visually impaired students can see this or not. Nobody says that, right? Nobody says, yeah, you know what, I don't really care if the video is on here and my deaf student can't hear it. Nobody does that, right? But these are things that happen because we don't think about it intentionally when we're talking about building our courses, when we're developing them. Sometimes we do end up accidentally weaving some bias in there, not because we're doing it on purpose, just because that's what happens. When we go in to put a video in there, we don't necessarily think about, is there going to be access for my deaf student? Or if I end up with a deaf student, can they access this? Do we think to ourselves, is there anybody in my class colorblind? Do you know if anyone in your class is colorblind? That was a wake up for me too. I had a student, when I was in the classroom, I had a student who told me they were having a hard time seeing a font on a presentation. And I was like, okay. So I'm like, everybody else can see, I don't understand what the big deal is. And then after class, he said, well, I'm colorblind. I can't see where the letters are. And I was like, never occurred to me to ask if any of my students were colorblind, right? I thought to ask them things like, have you ever had a 504 plan? Have you ever had an IEP? Have you ever been treated for anything that I need to know about so I can assist you? Do you need to be closer to a door because of your disability? Like, I thought about all these things and never once thought to ask, are you colorblind, right? Like, that was just like so simple. So sometimes things happen in our courses and it's never on purpose, but it's just the way of the game, right? We start building these things, we think it's great, we think it's awesome, and then someone's not represented, or there's nothing but Black women in my course because I think Black girl magic is wonderful, right? Which I do. However, we tend to look at images and imagery and things like that of people who look like us, right? And not necessarily that looks like the population in which we are serving. Right? And so that's another piece of that, is making sure that our students are seeing themselves in our course materials and things of that nature. But what happens is, sometimes, I know it's another one, I heard somebody go, oh no. It's a technology symposium. We integrate technology in our presentations. So I want you to think about, for a second, this question. What inequities do you think students could experience in an online course? Just based on what we just talked about a little bit, what kind of inequities do you think students have experienced? Or if you've taken an online course, what kind of inequities have you experienced in an online course? Either one. So let's talk about it. What kind of inequity, when you think about that online courses, can you imagine or have you seen in an online course? Not having alt text on a phone. Do you guys know what he's talking about? So whenever there's a picture, and we're gonna talk a little bit more about that in a second, whenever there's a picture on a website, on a course, on a PowerPoint, anywhere, there's alt text that can be attached to that, right? So if you don't put the text, so for example, when you go put a picture in PowerPoint, if you have the newest version of PowerPoint, it'll just say alt text on the bottom. If you click that box, you can actually put the description of what that is.
What is in the picture?
What is in the picture, right? So on my slide, where I had a picture of me, it actually was presenter photo, is what it said. And then on the CalPro logo, it said CalPro logo, right? So if someone could not see this and they downloaded my slides and were using a screen reader, it would tell them exactly what was on the page. So, and I'm gonna provide some links and tools for you, don't worry, it will be uploaded to the TDLS website. So you can actually use tools to verify that your alt text is there, that screen readers will read your stuff, all that great stuff. So don't worry, I'm not gonna just preach at you and not give you any tools for solutions. So very good. What other types of inequities can there be in online courses? No, she's right. What if there's one person posting constantly and no one else is doing anything, right? So I don't know if that's necessarily an equity situation or more of a class management situation, because if none of my class is participating, my job as an educator is to get them to participate, and then also to participate to keep the conversation going, right? So that you're at least not talking to yourself, right? That's where I was looking for someone to say that. Yes, and not that anything any of the rest of you didn't say wasn't about equity. It was, but we kept going on the technology end of it. And what he just said was the content may not be equitable. That is a very good point, right? What if as you can see, I'm a black person. I don't know if you were aware. I know, right? Shocking. So what if I am in a course, right? And every image in that course, every piece of text, everything in that course that I see does not relate to me at all. I don't see myself in it, right? Am I going to be as invested in it? Am I going to be likely to persist if I feel like I'm not represented in my course, right? Maybe, depends on how bad I want it, right? So those type of things matter, like what kind of content. If all my content is about people who are much younger than me, right? Am I gonna see myself in there if most of my students are between 45 and 50, but all my text is about the millennials and the elder millennial here, or about kids, right? We work in adult ed. How often do we have to use content that's for K-12, right? I'm in the middle of a project where we're producing a video series for adult educators. Why? Because we don't have very many, right? I can go to OTAN. OTAN's got a bunch. That's about as far as I can get it, right? Or links on the links website, right? So it's just equity of representation. All of those things matter, what kind of content we have in there. And that's representation of all students, regardless of their ability, their gender, their ethnicity, whether they speak English, whether they don't, their citizenship status, all of that. We don't want to at any point make students feel like they are not a valued member of our class. And even if it's on the internet, they're still a part of our class, right? So another thing that happens that can be a hindrance to equity is technology bias. So you can understand how technology bias exists and kind of think about the ways that we use technology in our online learning environments so that we don't present that bias to our students. Because one of the things when I was teaching in the classroom, and I taught a lot of different types of computer courses, one of the things that I would do in my computer concepts and Windows class was have my students do an online scavenger hunt, right? Where they had to find pictures of different things or whatever. And I started noticing a lot of my students were giving me back the same pictures. They would go with the same first result, right? And I started noticing that they weren't really necessarily looking for images that looked anything like them or like whatever, which wasn't a big deal at the time. But now that I understand how this works, I'm thinking about, well, does that activity really help my students find representation of themselves? Because if they're using something that's algorithm-based and they're looking up presidents or things like that, well, that's a bad example. There's not a lot of diversity in presidents. But if we're looking up CEOs, right? And they're always coming back with the same white guy over and over and over again. No offense, Kevin, you're great. And everyone else in the room. But if they keep coming back with the same person, then they may not start to realize that, oh, I can be a CEO even if I don't look like that guy, right? And so I started thinking about maybe I need to be more explicit with that. And so I started changing things around. So for my scavenger hunts, I'd be like, find a CEO that you would like to be like, right? And so then they go looking for someone whose description is something that they would like to be similar to. And it doesn't necessarily have to be someone who looks like them. It might just be someone who is a technology company CEO and that's who they want to be like, or things like that. But being more explicit and giving more clear instructions, right? If we're using algorithm-based things in our learning platforms, because a lot of our online learning platforms do come with search engines and search bars built in, so students can look for things, we might want to be more explicit when we're telling students to go look for specific context so that they're not always getting the same type of biased results. Because as much as Google might try to fix it, it's still a computer network, it's still a computer system, and it's still based on algorithms, right? And the thing is, if I, a human who is fallible and makes mistakes and is not perfect, put into that what my perception of something is, when you go to look it up, it's going to be based on my bias and then some, because the computer magnifies that beyond just what my bias is and takes it further, right? If you want to understand further how technology bias affects our world, there's this fantastic book by Ruha Benjamin, who is a wonderful person, called Race After Technology, the abolitionist tools for the new Jim Code is what she calls it. But it talks about all the different ways in which technology itself can become biased. Facial recognition software that doesn't identify black people, although it was created by a black woman, right? When she tested it, it would not recognize her own face unless she put a white mask on, right? She fixed it, relax, for her company. But however, the issue is rooted further down than that because there are learning tools that are connected to all of these pieces of software, and it's a blanket tool that's very managed by the government. And unfortunately, it's not something that can easily just be translated all over the place, right? And so my caution here is to think about how you're using algorithmic software in your classes so that you're not unintentionally creating bias in your online courses, right? Especially with activities and things like that that you're doing. But I will say that that is something that just happens with language development software. So I'm using Duolingo because I'm going to Mexico this summer and I want to be able to communicate with my host country, right? Because I think when you go to another country, it's nice to know a few phrases and be able to communicate. Like if I get kidnapped, I need to be able to ask for help. Or if I'm like, hey, you're cool, I want to be able to say that and he'd be like, who's this crazy person talking to me, right? But it sometimes doesn't recognize what I'm saying. And so I think I speak fast. I think we can all attest to this. You've been talking to me for a few minutes. I speak fast. And so sometimes it doesn't recognize the words that are coming out of my mouth if I don't enunciate perfectly. So I don't think it's just a Burlington English issue. I think that's another example of how algorithms are programmed to understand specific words and phrases, and that if you don't say it exactly that way, it doesn't understand you. Rosetta Stone is the only one I have found that is really good at understanding like really garbled language. Because I can't roll my R's to save my life. And I kept trying and I couldn't do it. And my son, who at the time was 3, comes running up and screams the word into my computer because I think he was sick of me saying it over and over again. And Rosetta Stone was like, good job. And I was like, dang, just ruined it for me. Anyway, and that's when I gave up on learning Spanish the last time. So moving on. Right, exactly. And I think that in and of itself is profound. Our adults, whether we're talking about ourselves or our students, we're learning and we acquire language. It's much harder as an adult to acquire language and have no accent. It is what it is. Not that it's impossible, but it is a lot harder. Yes, Tad or Todd? What's no accent? Well, I mean, realistically, that's true because accents are relative, right? So like, we're talking right now and it sounds fine.
You're from California, huh?
Right, exactly. That's a very good point, because accents are relative, right? To us in the US, we're like, we don't have an accent. Then you go somewhere else and they're like, Americans have the weirdest accents. Like, do I? I didn't know that. Or if I was in Texas earlier this week, and it's funny because I spend a lot of my time in the South, and when I'm in Texas or Alabama, it's always like, I'm like, oh, these people with great accent, like y'all too. But then they're like, you sound like a Valley girl. I'm like, no, I don't even have an accent. Right. Yes, I do. So very good point. Was it Todd or Tad? I can't. Tad. Thank you, Tad. So equity issues in online courses. Things for us to think about, okay? Whether or not software and applications are accessible to low-income and rural students. If you're serving a rural population, if you're not serving a rural population, then maybe whether or not the rural population can access your courses aren't that big of a deal. Like if you're in the heart of LA, you might not be wondering if somebody up by the Oregon coast can access your course or not, right? But if you're up by the Oregon coast, that's gonna matter to you, right? Software applications that are based on algorithms, we just explained why. My suggestion is do not rely solely on algorithmic-based information if you're trying to avoid bias in your courses. Make sure the content is, the issues could be that the content is not accessible to visually and hearing impaired, including those who are colorblind, including those who aren't completely deaf but might hear ringing in their ears, things of that nature, right? The content is not representative of the student population. That's a really big one, okay? You want to make sure, you like seeing yourself represented in things, right? I know I do, but I'm a little bit of a narcissist. But some people, most of us want to see ourselves represented, right? We want to relate to the content that we're reading, that we're seeing, that we're hearing, right? And so that is really important. And then the course is not offered based on an equitable need, but a perceived interest. Why do you think I italicized the word perceived?
We all different perceptions.
And sometimes the courses and pathways our students get placed on are not based on what the student wants and needs, but based on our assumptions of them, right? So the student comes into a class, into our office, and they're like, hey, I'm interested in learning about the course. I got this flyer, and your immediate assumption might be, oh, do you want to be in an ESL class if they're Hispanic? Or, oh, are you interested in ABE? Because they might seem like they're low income based on the way that they dress, right? So we can't make those kind of perceived assumptions. We need to wait and ask. And like, while I see a lot of you nodding your heads, but this is a very frequent issue. That students are not offered courses because the perceived need is not there. Well, that student doesn't need to be in that course because they're gonna be in this, right? But you don't know that student's life. You don't know if that student is working 2 jobs and taking care of kids, and an online course is the only way they can persist, right? And so I italicized the word perceived because we need to take our perceptions out of the equation when we're talking about student needs and goal setting. Not when we're talking about what's happening in our classrooms. Because teacher perception is a huge piece of understanding what students are going through in the classroom. But when we're talking about when the student first comes in our door, what we offer to them, we can't perceive their need. We need to let them identify their needs to us, right? Makes sense? I see some nodding. That always makes me feel hyped. Thank you. So let's talk about cultural competence. This is probably something you guys are already sort of doing. It's and I need to stop saying guys and gals, friends. You friends are already doing. Trying to get better about that. Why is this? Okay. So that's hard to see, and I apologize. So the first one is cultural destructiveness. That's when you, and I'm going to get into what all of these are. And then we have cultural incapacity here. I know that's hard to see. Cultural blindness, cultural pre-competence, we're getting there. Cultural competence, and then cultural proficiency. Cultural proficiency, not a lot of people are in cultural proficiency. And sometimes you have people in cultural proficiency, but it's hard to get an organization to cultural proficiency, right? So let's talk about what these things are. Because everybody's like, what does this mean? Don't worry, we'll get there. So cultural destructiveness is the dehumanization of specific aspects of a person, right? That signifies underlying bias of, or the superiority of whatever the dominant party is, right? So if we're talking about cultural destructiveness, that's your blatant, flat out, just racist, bigoted, just, well, I don't care, I'm just gonna say what I think, and blah, 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 right? We don't typically see that in the classroom directly, right? Unless, well, when we do, it's like viral on YouTube somewhere, and you're like, I can't believe they said that. Like, of course they got fired, right? So we don't see that a lot. But cultural incapacity does happen a lot, but a lot of times people don't realize it. The inability to work with diverse populations. Now, who in here, well, let me rephrase. No, I'm not gonna rephrase. Who in here feels like you work with someone that you feel like has cultural incapacity, that is not good at working with diverse cultures? A staff member. I'm not saying it's you. I didn't ask you who in here feels like you suffer from cultural incapacity. I would never do that. But who feels like you work with people who may not be that great at, right. They may not be too great at working with diverse populations, right? They might say things that you're like, you know, our students fall in that category, right? So that's that cultural incapacity. Somebody's chuckling like, oh, yeah. All right, and then we have cultural blindness. Now, I'll be honest. I've used the phrase in ignorance many years ago. I don't see color. We're all the same on the inside. I've used that phrase. I'm gonna tell the truth, I have done that. And then I read a book, or two, or three. But I became more knowledgeable in understanding why that's problematic over the years, right? When I was a teenager and I would hear people telling me, we shouldn't see color, we should all love each other, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, that's great. I don't want to see color either. We're all just going to be colorblind, right? I thought that was wonderful. And then I got in my 20s and I was like, hold up. I kind of want people to see me for who I actually am. Not despite who I am, but who I am, right? And I think part of that was becoming a mom and having mixed race children and identifying that that's going to be a challenge for them and realizing that. But I digress. Color blindness is not a good thing. Okay, when we say I don't see color, that's saying you don't see me or I don't see you, right? I do see you. I like you for who you are. That's part of you. So cultural blindness approaches are used by a lot of people that the practice is this is what's good for this is what's best for the greater good, right? They don't necessarily think about serving individual student populations, but they're thinking about how do we make this good for everybody, right? It's not so much about diversity, but it's more about making sure that everyone is is happy. But what ends up happening with that is that even when we're saying we're being colorblind, we still end up being represented by one particular group, right? And so that's not cultural competence. That's not inclusion, right? So yeah, I'll leave that one alone. Cultural pre-competence. This is when we're getting there, right? This is where we want to at least get here, where we're trying to understand each other. And I feel like everybody in this room is at least here, if not further, because you wouldn't have come to a session on equity if you weren't interested in hearing about these things, right? So cultural pre-competence is awareness of differences in cross-cultural communication and outreach, right? Who knows what the term intersectionality means? He said in the example of feminism, it's representative of all women, no matter what, right? I work with an American Institute for Research. I am the co-chair of one of our employee resource groups. And those are all, we have a Pride group, we have a Black Diaspora group, we have Air Viva, which is our Hispanic ladies, Asians in Motions, a bunch of them. So one of the ones I work with is our Stars and Stripes ERG, because I'm a veteran, and so I think veteran representation matters, right? I'm a member of a bunch of different ERGs. But what we started seeing was the intersectionality from the other groups, right? The Black diaspora group was identifying needs and things that they needed that the Pride group was identifying. And then we were talking about struggles that we were having with veterans about lack of representation, lack of support, and things like that. And we started realizing we have a lot of things in common. So when we're talking about our students, right, our students have found themselves in a centralized location, whether it's online, in a centralized online learning environment, or in your classroom. There's an intersectionality there. They have something in common. They have a common need, right? And so, but we have to be able to meet their needs and make sure that they all feel represented and supported at the same time, right? So when we have that cultural pre-competence, we understand that while we do have one group of students, we have a diverse population of students, especially in adult ed. There's a lot of intersectionality there, but they also have individual needs and need individual supports, right? Whether we're talking about an ESL class that is concerned about doing the census because they don't know if that means they're going to get deported, right? But we need to educate them on what that is, right? If we're talking about a CTE class that has varying levels of education within that class, but they all want to get that industry certification. Some of them want to go to work, some of them want to go to college, right? If we're talking about an ABE class, some of them are really strong in science and math and are working. And some of them are not as good in science and math and haven't been able to get the job because they can't pass that employability test, right? So we have all these different students that have varying and diverse needs and experiences. And what do we know about adult learners and about their life experience? It's really important. Yes, that's true. What did you say?
Funds of knowledge.
Funds of knowledge.
Serious.
He's almost quoting Malcolm Knowles. Yes, adult learners' experiences are a wealth of knowledge for them, and their past experiences can actually lend themselves to being leveraged in the class, right? So you can pull information in. But we need to be understanding of all these things about our students to get to this cultural pre-competence space, right? That doesn't mean we know everything. That doesn't mean we always remember to always represent every student in the room. It means we're trying to get there. We understand the importance of it. This is where we need to make sure at least everybody gets, right? But where we really want to be is at cultural competence. Cultural competence is demonstrated by a commitment to a diverse population in all aspects, instructions, and structures and functions of the organization, all over the place. From the way we enroll students, how we choose their courses, how we let them choose their courses, how we treat them while they're in our courses, whether face-to-face or online, right? By all people. And this is why I say it's not too difficult for a person to be culturally competent. It is really unusual for an entire organization to be culturally competent because that means all of the staff also is. And when I said, how many of you know someone who may not be there, right? That's inclusive of how your organization is. And so you, change agents, will be going back and helping to improve that. And last is cultural proficiency. It's demonstrated by the centrality of the school's commitment to diversity and by its external expertise, leadership, and proactive advocacy in promoting appropriate care of diverse populations, right? So you, change agents, are in charge of making sure on your online courses, when you're developing them, that your students are all represented, that they all have access, right? And then they can all utilize the tools that you're giving to them. If there is one student that you feel like is not included in that equation, then you have to reevaluate how you do things. I'm not saying the second you get a new ethnicity in your class or someone from a different country that you've never met before, you're like, I've never met anybody from Tanzania. Let me go redesign my whole course. That's not what I'm saying. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that make an effort to make sure that your courses are indicative and demonstrate and inclusive of your typical student population, right? So if your typical student population is not all white people, what do you think the images in your course should look like? Right, what she said, not all white people, right? And if you're serving quite a few students with disabilities also, maybe include pictures of people with disabilities. There are a lot of people with disabilities who've done amazing things. What'd you say? Even if you're not, yes. Representation matters, and displaying that and showing, it normalizes it, if anything. It makes our students used to seeing people who look like them, people who look different from them, and people who have different abilities than they do. And so when they see that, they go out into the world, and it's not as unusual when they see that, right? So what's included in cultural competence? Like, how do I know when I'm really cultural competent? Well, I'm self-aware, right? And part of that self-awareness is understanding and acknowledging our own biases, right? Now, there are a lot of tools online. I personally love the Implicit Project, right? There's a lot of arguments for and against implicit bias testing. So some people just don't like the term implicit bias, right? On both sides of the aisle. There might be one group that says, I don't like the term implicit bias because it excuses racism. And there's another side of the group that says, I don't like the term explicit bias because it makes everything racism, right? Where actually what we're saying is everybody has some form of bias and we need to identify it so we can overcome it, right? So you can look at implicit bias tests online. Harvard has one. Just look up implicit bias test. It's really easy to find. And there's all kinds. You can identify if you have bias against people with tattoos like me. Who doesn't like me because of my tattoos? It's fine. I can take it. I can take it. If based on culture, based on age, things like that. I did this. I was at a conference, I don't even know how many years ago. It was before the book Blind Spot had even come out. And that book is based on the implicit bias test, right? And it was introduced to us. And so I went to my hotel room that night and I'm like, I'm going to do this implicit bias test. I don't think I have any biases. I'm just, I mean, I'm a multicultural person, right? Who's multiracial. Ancestry DNA verified it. I'm 27% European. My husband, who is like 87% European, thinks that's hilarious. But I learned all these things about myself, and I'm like, I don't have bias. So the first one I did was men versus women. Like, do I have bias against men, right? And I'm like, I don't. I like dudes. I got a husband. I like him. I have sons. I like them. We're good, right? I had a bias against men. I did. You wouldn't know because I'm nice to Jerry and what's that dude's name? Kevin? But I did. And then I started thinking about it because at the time I was still in the classroom and I was leading my CTE department and I realized there was not a single guy on any of our publications. Not one. Not a brochure with his picture on it. And we'd had some male students, but I had not put a single male in any of my flyers. And after taking the bias test and then coming back and looking at that, I was like, maybe I do have a bias. That's problematic, right? And so, Kevin, did you know I had a bias against men? No, I didn't. No. And I don't feel like, maybe I do still, I don't know. Because since that time, I've been actively making sure I'm not leaving guys out when I'm doing my publications, when I'm talking about people in the classroom, that I'm using him and her, right? We have a tendency when we talk about teachers to say she, right? And when we talk about principals to say he. Guess what? Teachers can be male and female. Who knew? Administrators, same. That's crazy, right? So self-awareness is a huge part of that. So identifying one's own bias is the only way we can actually overcome bias, and so you have to be self-aware of that. Sometimes we know what our biases are, we can feel that, and we already know, and sometimes we are like me, and we think we're above it all, and it turns out we're not, right? Cultural understanding. Cultural understanding is a little trickier. I may want to have cultural understanding. That doesn't mean that I do have cultural understanding. What do you think is the best way to gain cultural understanding? Exactly. Listen to people who you want to learn from. I heard someone say people from other cultures. Yes, right? You can do it in a bubble if you like. You can just go on the interwebs. Old school phrase to mess with everybody on their technology day. You can go onto the interwebs and just Google things and read about it, right? That's one way. And I do suggest that before entering into a dialogue with someone to learn from them, maybe read up on it a little bit because they may not have the energy to be your teacher all day, right? So, but you can go online, you can read about it and try to gain some understanding. But the best way, and multiple studies have shown this, the best way to overcome bias is get to know someone with that bias of the ethnicity, gender, whatever, of that you hold the bias. Because it normalizes them to you. Then you realize that this is a normal human being. This is someone who has value and that I would like to understand better, right? So cultural understanding is a huge piece of cultural competence. And that doesn't mean you automatically just know. You have to kind of do your homework and make the attempt. That one is a little bit harder than self-awareness. I love that you just said that. It's a certain level of humbling yourself, right? To go to them and being like, I don't understand, but I want to understand. And I read this, and I've never been there. I don't know how true that is, right? And as a teacher, to go to a student and say, I need you to tell me because I don't understand, that takes a certain level of humbleness, right? But we have to be willing to go before our students and say, hey, I want to get to know you and your culture better, right? And I want to make sure I'm doing this right. And I think that's a wonderful thing to do. All right, next one, multiple perspectives. Multiple perspectives are included in cultural competence. If we are going to identify if our school is culturally competent, we're not going to rely on just what Sudie thinks, right? Why is that? Sudie has bias. Everybody has bias, right? And so we're looking at multiple perspectives of what that cultural competence looks like. We're not going to just let one person identify, are we being culturally competent? Because if I say, yeah, I think we're doing this great, I think we're doing whatever, and then I go to you, Valerie, and Valerie says, yeah, well, I think we do that okay, but maybe we could do a little bit better with being more inclusive at our orientations, because we always call them the students who look like this, right? And then I come over to David, and David says, yeah, once we get that down, I think we also need to talk about the types of food that we're including in here, right? Or maybe take down the no fish in the cafeteria sign, because that's part of some people's cultures, right? So this is why you need more than one person to identify your cultural competence level at your school and to work towards it. Because if you do that in a bubble by yourself, first of all, you won't see significant change. Two, you won't see your own blind spots. Next, intercultural communication. I once had someone who had done something very negative to me in the workplace say to me, you know, I didn't mean to do that, you're my homegirl. Never heard her use that phrase before, ever. And immediately I was like, why would you call me your homegirl? I don't even call myself anybody's homegirl. That was weird. And there's a certain level of bias to that, because they assumed that's how I talk, right? I've had people say to me to my face, you're so well-spoken for a black girl. And the thing was, they thought it was a compliment, right? That makes it that much worse, right? So when we're talking about intercultural communication, the words, the phrases, the symbolism, the way we move our bodies and our hands matters. I had a student once, the same person who called me their homegirl, as a matter of fact, came into my classroom and she needed to talk to a student and she goes, hey, right? And the student was like she made the face that she made was like she was clearly offended, right? And so she went and talked to her and she came back and I was like, Falmata, what was going on? And then she explained to me what that symbol means in her country. And since that time, we used this instead. Because we don't want to offend anybody. We need to think about how our words, our phrases, our symbolism. Did you just explain it? Oh. Our words, our phrases, our symbolism, things like that mean different things in different cultures. Again, that's not to say you're going to change everything the second somebody brand new comes in your class, but you do need to think about, is what I'm doing explicitly offensive in their home country, right? Okay, next is relationship building. We don't just build relationships with the students who look like us, right? And the thing is, and I'm going to be honest with you, this can be a little bit exhausting for me. When I was in the classroom, I would often be like the counselor / spokesperson for the students who looked like me, which meant that teachers were often saying, okay, well, if you're struggling with that, go talk to Miss Whalen. Go talk to Sudie. She can help you with that. Or they'd be like, hey, Sudie, I'm having this issue in my class. Could you talk to so-and-so? And that person would very often be black. And it wasn't because they were racist or whatever. It was because they felt like I would relate to them better. But the thing is, I don't get paid extra for relating to people who just because they look like me. And we all need to have the ability to relate to and talk to all of our students. It is not the responsibility of your minority teachers to talk to the minority students. And it's not the responsibility of the white teachers to talk to the white students. Everybody should be doing that. And that's the thing. There's going to be times when students are more comfortable talking to somebody that looks like them, and that's fine. If the student comes to you and they're more comfortable talking to you, that's great. But one of the things I used to do is be like, you know, you can talk to Cheryl about these things too. She's great, and she'd be willing to talk to you, right? So that my students understood that I am not the only person on campus they can speak with, right? That no one else is a threat. We can all work together because they're all of our students, right? So, and I'd like that you ask that question because yes, sometimes there are going to be, you need someone with a specific ability to help them. If you can't help a student and I have the ability to help a student, it doesn't matter our ethnicity. I have that ability so I can go help them, right? And that's something that happens a lot of times with people of color when we're talking to each other or even the people who aren't people of color and we're asking for recommendations like, you'll like them, they're black. It's like, I like people who aren't black too, just saying. And also, and I'm glad you brought that up about assumptions we make about students, because students make assumptions about themselves, too. How many of you heard the phrase stereotype threat? Stereotype threat. Okay, write this down if you've never heard of it. Whistling Vivaldi. Whistling Vivaldi by Dr. Claude M. Steele. Whistling Vivaldi, like the composer. Vivaldi. But it's by Dr. Claude Steele, Claude M. Steele. So Whistling Vivaldi is a book all about stereotype threat and about how stereotypes affect students' ability to take tests, to perform, things like that. And what they found was it did not matter the demographic of the student. Every ethnicity and race and gender are affected by some form of stereotype threat. And an example of that was they asked a bunch of black students to do that. They told them we're going to do a golf challenge, and it's based on sportsmanship. Black kids did just as well as the white kids did. Everybody's like, we can putt this way. This is awesome. I've got athletic ability. But then when they did a separate group, and they said, okay, this golf challenge is based on your ability to measure mentally the angles that you need to hit the ball in order to get it in. They didn't do as well. Why do you think that was? It had nothing to do about angle. I mean, it was literally the same test. It was how frequently can you get the ball in there? The first time this is just based on your sports ability. The second time was based on your math. That's what they were told. And what it was is that black students were more likely to be told that they were not as good at math, right? Same thing happened with women. Asian women, when they were told to write about just their culture, right? They did fine. When they were told to write about math, they didn't do as well. And we're always told Asians are great at math. But when you ask Asian women to do a writing assignment based on mathematics, they didn't do as well, right? Same happened with white males when they were given an obstacle course. And they said, okay, this first time you go through, it's going to measure your sports ability and see how fast you can go, right? They didn't do as well as the Hispanic and the black students. When they send them back through and they're like, this time it's going to check how well you can measure how far you have to jump and all this and that, they did better because they thought it was about academic ability, right? So what I'm pointing out is that all students are in some way affected by stereotype, not every student, all demographics of students can be affected by stereotype threat. And what that means is it's this added stress of thinking you're not going to do very well, and so you don't do very well, right? And so if our teachers assume that students don't do very well, they won't do as well. And so when we're talking about that relationship building, right, in our classrooms, this is why it's important to connect to all of our students. Because if our students feel like we only like certain students that look like us, right, or certain students who speak clearer English, or students who are not immigrants, or whatever, if they feel that, they're not going to perform as well in your classroom because that's adding stress. So anyway, if you have time, check out the book, read the Spark Notes. It's fantastic. Shameless plug, Dr. Steele is actually an American Institutes for Research fellow. I was so excited when I found that out. I didn't know when I took the job, and I was like, what? I'm such a fan. Anyway, moving on. Flexibility and adaptability. You need to be flexible and willing to adapt to your students' cultural and diverse needs, right? And again, do not forget about ability and accessibility. We're not just talking about race and ethnicity and gender here. We're also talking about ability, okay? Intercultural facilitation of conflict resolution skills, right? If students are having an argument and and it happens sometimes in our classrooms, and it is based on race and ethnicity, and there can be times where it's, for example, I had a teacher tell me that she had a lot of Afghani women in her class, but they were from different villages, and they didn't actually like each other, and they oftentimes would avoid one another, so when they were grouped together, it was a problem, right? You have to have the ability to work through that with your students, right? To help them become better. So that if you're modeling that for them, then they get to see that happening, and then you're sharing with them, this is how we talk to each other, this is how we work together. We have to collaborate in the real world, even if it's someone that we didn't like from our home country, right? You just have to do that anyway. If we model that, students become better at doing that, and they take that with them. And last is multicultural organizational development skills, right? That's being able to develop and build up people within your organization from various cultures, right? And it should go without saying, but your staff should look similar to your student body. No. I didn't say the only staff you should have should look like your student body. I'm saying if you are predominantly in a Hispanic neighborhood, for example, and you have no Hispanic teachers, why? That's a problem. You should have, like, if you have students signing up for ESL classes, you should have an interpreter that can help them sign up for their ESL classes. So no, I'm not saying that students should never talk to people that don't look like, I'm saying that your representation of your student population should also be in your staff. And I'm not saying if you're in a Hispanic neighborhood, everybody needs to be Hispanic. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying there should be people that look similar to them in the building, right? Everybody in the building should be able to support the student. But it's a little different when you walk into the building and you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm supposed to be here because nobody looks like me. And maybe they don't feel as comfortable at first. So that's a lot of research on that too. So we're skipping that online equity question. But let's just go ahead and talk about it. We're not going to do the poll. But how do you currently, in your physical classrooms, reflect cultural competency? Like right now in your classes, what do you do to improve cultural competencies, cultural relationships, and things like that in your class? Awesome. I like that. Did you hear what she said? She does name cards where she has their name and their home country, and then she puts them in mixed groups so they get to be working with diverse populations themselves. Yes. And the thing is, this is not a trick question. You guys probably are already doing things and I'm realizing you're doing it. How many of you have pictures in your classrooms? How many of the pictures in your class? So raise your hand if you have photos or some kind of graphic art in your classroom walls. Flags, anything. Okay. Okay, keep your hands up, keep your hands up. Okay, keep your hands up if that represents more than one ethnicity, race, or culture. You're already demonstrating cultural competence in your classrooms, right? So I was like, I'm doing it, yes. So the reason I bring this up is because I want you to take that into your online learning environments. The same way you would want your students represented in the posters on your walls, that you want to show that females can be successful CEOs just as males can be successful CEOs, or that males can be successful nurses just as females can be successful nurses, or that women can be welders the same way men can be welders. Like how we do that signage. We're very intentional in adult education with trying to make sure we represent everybody on our bulletin boards, right? We are the masters of the bulletin boards, right? Take that into your online learning environments, so that the students are the same way you want to make sure everybody feels included in your classroom, you want them to feel included in your online courses. So things that we can do to model cultural competence: scaffolding, using elements of the student's culture and putting it into components of your classwork, right? The next one is the zones of proximal development. We're not going to get super deep into that, but the ZPD is basically the level from which your students can do something on their own with you and with help, with you guiding them, to where they can do it on their own without needing help. And part of that is how much they believe they can do it on their own, right? So then the next part is improving outcomes, letting students demonstrate their own capabilities to the teacher in various ways, like letting them write about their culture, letting them write about the things that they're good at, letting them talk about these different things, and helping them and encouraging them to build upon that, right? So there's a lot of things that we can do to improve academic performance, right, that is culturally inclusive. So moving more into this, assure access, equity of access. This is the biggest piece, okay? These web tools are free tools to check your accessibility of your websites. If you have a web page for your class, right? You can use these to just run a check to see, is my website accessible or not, right? One of them is free, one is not free. This list of availability checkers, there's a couple on here that are fee and then some are not. This one is completely free, has all free tools. Sure, another way is we're talking about screen readers, so people who can't see can hear, right? Non-visual desktop, NVDA, it's completely free, right? It's a great screen reader. One of the things I like to do when I'm developing online courses, and I do that, I develop new courses every year, is once I think I'm done, I take a screen reader and let the screen reader go through the entire course and all the content. It takes forever. But the second it gets to a part that isn't working, I stop there, I fix it, and I go through the screen reader again. That's a part of our process, right? JAWS is another really good one. It's a little bit easier to use, but it's also not free. So here's our little mini checklist for any kind of applications and software that you're using with your online course. Make sure it's available on more than one app store. If you're telling students you can access this on your phone, is it only accessible on an iPhone? Because students who don't have a lot of money often don't have an iPhone, right? Do they work on various operating systems? If it works on your Mac, is it going to work on their Windows? Okay. Will the student be required to spend money to use it? For me, as a rule of thumb, if it costs them something, I'm not going to recommend it to them. Do they work for English language learners, right? I was a CTE teacher who had plenty of students in my class that were not fluent in English. So I always try to make sure that whatever I was recommending software-wise could be translated for them. Is it accessible to those who are visually and hearing impaired? And do not forget people who are colorblind. That's a huge thing. Like ever since I had that wake-up call, I started realizing all the stuff I was doing that colorblind people probably couldn't see, and I was ashamed of myself. And then, is it accessible to students in rural areas if applicable? If you know you're serving students in rural areas, you really have to think to yourself, can they access this online course with the bandwidth available in my area, right? All right, and then don't forget representation matters. Demonstrate diversity in online content, just like what he said earlier. Subjects and videos and graphic imagery, make sure that they are diverse. It's good for students to see people who look like them, but it's also good for students to see people who don't look like them, so they get used to seeing various cultures. Make sure the subjects in curriculum are diverse. Subjects of examples of failure and success are diverse. One of the things I notice a lot of times is when you start talking about, and cartoon imagery especially, when like good day versus bad day, the good day is blonde hair, blue eyes, and bright, and then the bad day is like dark hair, dark skin, and dark eyes, right? I don't look like a bad day, do I? Just saying. I mean, maybe I do. I haven't seen myself in the mirror for a few hours, but who knows? And then don't solely rely on algorithm-based technology. There is so much research out there about the biasness of it. So if you're using it, just make sure you're being more explicit when you're telling them to look for things and search for stuff so that they're seeing things other than the stereotypical thing. So that when they look up a teacher, they're not only seeing women, and when they look up an administrator, they're not only seeing men, right? So like the example I gave earlier, when I told my students go look up a CEO, I changed it to look up a CEO that you would be interested in being, right? And so then they were like, what does that mean? Okay, what kind of company would you like to lead? What do you think your CEO should look like? Like just having that, and then let them decide how they want to take it. So it gives a little bit more autonomy to the student, but it also broadens their search results too. So because I have to make my CalPro shameless plug because it is one of the projects I work on, we do have an upcoming training module. It's actually in pilot this month and will be out to the public in the fall, called Success for All Learners Through Equity. And it's all about cultural competence. It's about hard conversations with looking at implicit bias, talking about microaggressions and why that's problematic, and all kinds of stuff like that. It is a little heavier than what CalPro typically does. So whether or not we will eventually offer this online to one of our CalPro facilitators to facilitate, we haven't decided, because it is kind of hard to have those heavier conversations in an online platform. It's not impossible, but tone gets lost on the internet, right? So we're still debating that. But you will be able to host that for free this fall. So if you're thinking about doing equity training and you want to be that change agent and you're like, we need to get our organization to cultural competency, we have a module for that. So you can reach out to me or reach out to calpro@air.org and request the training this fall.
What does that mean when you have a module?
It's a training module. So it's a blended, no, it's a training. It's a face-to-face and online training. So CalPro is run by American Institutes for Research. It's a California Department of Ed funded project that offers free professional development to all teachers and administrators, adult education teachers and administrators across the state. And we only in California. We have similar projects. We have one in Texas, one in Nevada, Arizona, things like that. This one is very specific. The biggest one actually in the country is the one that we have here in California. And then you can request PD for your state through links. So yeah, that's another option too. And then there's always, and again, the problem is that things that aren't free, right? You can always request PD from various organizations, but then you pay for it. But yeah, if you want to talk with Judy Mortrude, who's the director at Links, she can talk with you about scheduling PD, working with Oregon Department of Education, having someone come out and do trainings and things like that based on topics that you're interested in. Yeah, and I can get you her information too. She's great. I like her a lot. Any other questions? There was a graphic there, but it's gone now. Other questions? No, but I believe in all of you. And the thing is, if you don't feel like you know enough yet, do the research, email me. I'm happy to send you a book list to tell you the research and the resources that we use to develop the module, anything that you want. I'm always here to support. I reply to emails at all hours of the day and night, much to my husband's chagrin. But if you have questions, or if you feel like you really want to take this on, you really want to talk to your agency about hosting something on equity or about just having cultural competent conversations, email me and I'd be happy to help you work through that, okay? All right, thank you guys so much. Have a beautiful rest of your Friday.
www.otan.us